The sun was setting over the peaceful suburbs of Atlanta, painting the sky in beautiful shades of orange and pink. Officer Thompson was doing his usual patrol in his police cruiser, sipping on his now-cold coffee from the morning shift. He'd been on the force for 8 years, and lately his fellow officers had noticed he'd become increasingly rigid and quick to judge. The streets were quiet that Sunday afternoon, with just a few kids riding their bikes and elderly couples taking their evening walks. Thompson's eyes narrowed as he spotted a black Mercedes with tinted windows gliding through the neighborhood. The car was well-maintained and clearly expensive, something that immediately triggered his prejudiced mindset in this predominantly white area. He followed the vehicle for a few blocks, looking for any reason to pull it over. His patience was rewarded when the Mercedes rolled through a stop sign, barely slowing down. Without hesitation, he flipped on his lights and sirens, a slight smirk playing across his face as he radioed in the traffic stop. The Mercedes pulled over promptly and properly, which slightly annoyed Thompson. He'd been hoping for some resistance. He sat in his cruiser for an extra minute, a common tactic he used to make people nervous. Through his windshield, he could see the driver was a black woman, apparently alone in the vehicle. She seemed to be calmly waiting, hands visible on the steering wheel, again doing everything right, which only served to irritate him more. Thompson adjusted his body camera and stepped out of his patrol car, his hand resting near his holster, a completely unnecessary gesture for a simple traffic stop. His boots crunched on the gravel as he approached, shining his flashlight directly into the driver's side window despite the fact that it was still light outside. The window rolled down smoothly, revealing a professional-looking woman in her early 40s. She was wearing a casual but expensive-looking blouse, and her calm demeanor suggested she was used to handling stressful situations. But Thompson wasn't interested in any of that. His voice came out harsh and demanding, a tone he'd never use in the wealthy white neighborhoods on the other side of town. "License and registration," he barked, not even bothering with the usual greeting or explanation for the stop. The woman's eyebrows raised slightly at his tone, but she remained composed. "May I ask why I'm being pulled over, officer?" she asked politely, her voice steady and clear. Thompson's jaw tightened. He hated when they asked questions. "I said, license and registration," he repeated, louder this time, as if volume would somehow make his authority more real. "You can worry about the reason after you comply with my orders." As the woman reached for her purse on the passenger seat, Thompson's hand tightened on his holster. In his mind, every movement was potentially threatening, despite the woman's obvious cooperation and professional demeanor. Little did he know, this traffic stop was about to become one of the biggest mistakes of his career. The whole scene was being captured by his body camera, the unnecessary aggression, the unprofessional tone, the clear bias in his approach. Later, this footage would tell a story that would make headlines across the country, but for now, Thompson was only focused on asserting his authority over someone he'd already judged based on nothing more than race and a nice car. What happened next would change not just Thompson's career, but the entire department's approach to training and bias awareness. As the woman reached for her credentials, none of them knew they were about to become part of a story that would spark important conversations about racism within law enforcement across the nation. Inside the black Mercedes, the police captain kept her breathing steady as she reached for her credentials. After 15 years on the force, she knew exactly how these situations could spiral out of control. She'd seen it happen to others, trained officers about it, and now here she was, experiencing it firsthand. "Keep your hands where I can see them," Officer Thompson shouted, his voice carrying across the quiet suburban street. A couple walking their dog on the sidewalk stopped to stare. The captain noticed them in her side mirror, along with 2 teenagers who had paused their basketball game to watch the scene unfold. "Officer," she began calmly, "I'm going to reach for my credentials now. They're in my purse on the passenger seat." She narrated her movements clearly, the way she'd taught countless civilians to do during community outreach programs. The irony wasn't lost on her. Here she was, a decorated police captain, having to use the same protective strategies she taught others. But Officer Thompson wasn't interested in her careful compliance. "Just hurry up," he snapped, his flashlight beam still pointed aggressively at her face despite the lingering daylight. His free hand hadn't moved from his holster, a detail that made her stomach tighten. As a captain, she knew there was absolutely no reason for him to have his hand there during a routine traffic stop with a compliant driver. She slowly reached for her purse, making sure her movements were deliberate and visible. Inside, alongside her driver's license, sat her police badge and ID, proof of her rank that would turn this entire situation on its head. But before she could retrieve them, Officer Thompson's patience ran out. "That's it, step out of the vehicle," he ordered, already reaching for the door handle. The captain's heart raced, but her voice remained steady. "Officer, if you'll just give me a moment, I'm reaching for my identification." "Out, now." He yanked the door open, the aggressive action causing her purse to tumble from the passenger seat, spilling its contents onto the floor. The captain maintained her composure, even as she saw her badge slide under the seat, just out of reach. The growing crowd of onlookers made her particularly conscious of how this scene would appear. She was dressed casually in jeans and a blouse, nothing identifying her as law enforcement. To anyone watching, this was just another incident of police harassment, and in a way, that's exactly what it was, badge or no badge. As she carefully stepped out of her car, she noticed more people gathering. Phones were out, recording the incident. While part of her wanted to announce her rank immediately, years of experience told her that an angry officer might escalate even more if he felt his authority was being challenged. She needed to handle this carefully. "Officer," she tried again, her tone professional but firm, "I need to inform you." But Thompson cut her off again, this time grabbing her arm roughly. The captain winced, not from pain, but from the realization that this officer's actions were going to have serious consequences for him once the truth came out. In the distance, she heard the distinctive sound of more sirens approaching. Thompson had apparently called for backup, likely assuming she was being uncooperative simply because she tried to explain herself. The captain almost smiled, knowing those approaching officers would probably recognize her immediately. She could have resisted. She could have fought back, legally and physically, she had every right to. But she knew that wasn't the answer. This moment, as uncomfortable and infuriating as it was, would become something more important. It would become a teaching moment, a catalyst for change, and evidence of the very problems she'd been fighting to address within the force. As the backup units pulled up, their lights painting the suburban street in flashing red and blue, the captain stood calmly beside her car. She watched Officer Thompson's face, knowing that in just a few moments, his entire world was about to shift dramatically. Sometimes the best lessons came from the most unexpected situations, and this was about to become a lesson no one in the department would ever forget. The situation was escalating faster than anyone could have anticipated. As backup units arrived at the scene, their sirens piercing the peaceful suburban evening, Officer Thompson maintained his grip on the captain's arm. The growing crowd of onlookers had their phones raised, recording every moment of what they believed was yet another case of police harassment. "Face the vehicle," Thompson ordered, his voice betraying a mix of anger and nervousness. The captain complied, placing her hands on the hood of her Mercedes. She could feel the engine's remaining warmth through her palms, a stark contrast to the cold treatment she was receiving. In her mind, she was already composing the report she would file about this incident, not out of vengeance, but because such behavior needed to be documented and addressed. The first backup officer pulled up, stepping out of his patrol car with uncertainty written across his face. The scene before him didn't match the uncooperative subject call he'd received. Instead, he saw a well-dressed, professional-looking woman calmly standing against a luxury car while his colleague acted unnecessarily aggressive. "I need to check the vehicle," Thompson announced, moving toward the open driver's door. The captain knew her badge was still lying under the seat, not there when her purse had spilled. Part of her wanted to let this play out, to let Officer Thompson dig himself deeper into this hole of his own making. But her years of leadership experience told her that wouldn't serve any productive purpose. "Officer," she began again, her voice carrying the natural authority that came with her rank, "if you look under the front seat, you'll find something very interesting." Thompson ignored her, busy rifling through the papers that had scattered across the car floor. The backup officer, however, was paying close attention, something about the woman's tone making pause. More patrol cars were arriving now. The quiet suburban street had transformed into an impromptu police convention, with red and blue lights bouncing off the well-maintained houses. Neighbors had come out onto their porches, watching the scene unfold with concerned expressions. Some were live streaming the incident, ensuring that every moment was being preserved. "There's nothing here but some dropped papers," Thompson said, frustration evident in his voice. He turned back to the captain, who remained perfectly still against her car. "Why were you reaching around so suspiciously?" A third officer had approached the scene now, and the captain noticed immediate recognition flash across his face. She'd supervised his training just 6 months ago. His eyes widened as he realized the gravity of the situation unfolding before him. "Sir," the young officer spoke up, his voice slightly shaky, "I think you should." "Stay back," Thompson cut him off. "I've got this under control." But nothing was under control, and everyone except Thompson seemed to realize it. The crowd had grown larger, their murmurs of disapproval getting louder. Some were shouting about police harassment, others were calling out to film everything. The captain took a deep breath. The teaching moment she'd been waiting for had arrived. "Officer Thompson," she said, her voice carrying the weight of her rank, "I suggest you reach under the front seat of my vehicle. My badge and department ID are there, along with my commission card identifying me as a captain in your department." The silence that followed was deafening. Thompson froze, his hand still resting on his holster. The backup officers exchanged knowing looks, already understanding that this situation had just become much more complicated. The young officer who recognized her took a step forward, ready to confirm her identity. From her position against the car, the captain could see the exact moment reality began to dawn on Thompson's face. His expression shifted from anger to confusion, then to the first hints of fear as he processed what she just said. He moved slowly back to the car, kneeling to look under the seat where she indicated. The crowd watched in tense silence as Thompson's hand emerged from under the seat, holding a leather wallet. The gold badge caught the light from the street lamps that had just flickered on, its significance impossible to miss. When he opened the wallet and saw the ID card inside, the color drained from his face so quickly that the captain thought he might faint. This moment, this exact second of realization, would change not just Officer Thompson's career, but would become a turning point for the entire department. As he stared at the badge in his trembling hands, everyone present knew they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years to come. The badge in Officer Thompson's hands seemed to grow heavier with each passing second. The gold shield gleamed under the street lights, and the word "Captain" stood out clearly on the ID card beside it. His mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. The crowd of onlookers, still recording everything on their phones, had fallen into a hushed silence, sensing that something significant was happening. I didn't." Thompson stammered, his previous authority crumbling like a sandcastle in the tide. The captain slowly turned around, no longer feeling the need to maintain her position against the vehicle. Every officer on scene, except Thompson, immediately stood at attention, their training kicking in automatically in the presence of a superior officer. "At ease, everyone," she said calmly, her voice carrying naturally across the now quiet street. She straightened her blouse where Thompson's rough handling had wrinkled it, then held out her hand for her badge. Thompson handed it over as if it might burn him, his face a mix of shock, embarrassment, and growing fear. The young officer who had recognized her earlier stepped forward. "Captain, would you like me to call the watch commander?" he asked, already pulling out his phone. The captain nodded, then turned her attention back to Thompson, who looked like he wanted nothing more than to disappear into the growing darkness. "Officer Thompson," she began, her voice level but firm, "I believe we need to have a conversation about what just happened here." She gestured to his body camera. "Your camera is still running, correct?" Thompson nodded weakly, suddenly very aware of the device that had recorded every moment of his inappropriate behavior. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. The very technology meant to protect officers from false accusations had just documented a textbook case of racial profiling against one of their own senior officers. The crowd was beginning to understand what they were witnessing. Whispers spread through the gathered people as they realized the woman they'd seen being harassed was actually a police captain. Some were already posting their videos online, adding captions about the unexpected twist. The story was about to go viral, though nobody knew it yet. I want all officers present to submit detailed reports before the end of their shifts, the captain instructed, her natural authority making it clear this wasn't a suggestion. Officer Thompson, you'll need to remain on scene until the watch commander arrives. She turned to address the gathering of bystanders. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your concern, but this situation is now under control. Please give us some space to handle this professionally. Some of the onlookers began to disperse, but many stayed, continuing to record. They wanted to see how the department would handle one of their own being caught in such a blatant display of prejudice. The captain understood their interest. This was exactly the kind of accountability the public had been demanding. The watch commander's car pulled up just then, its lights cutting through the evening darkness. As he stepped out, his face showed he already knew the gravity of the situation. News traveled fast in the department, and word of a captain being profiled by one of their own officers had probably reached him before he even got in his car. Thompson stood rooted to the spot, his earlier aggression replaced by a vacant stare. Everything he'd done in the last 30 minutes was replaying in his mind. The unnecessary aggression, the hand on his holster, the rough handling, the refusal to listen, all directed at a superior officer. His career flashed before his eyes, each moment of the traffic stop now feeling like another nail in its coffin. The captain watched various emotions playing across Thompson's face: fear, regret, shame, and finally, understanding. This was the moment she'd been waiting for, the realization she hoped would stick with him. It wasn't about her rank or the trouble he was in. It was about recognizing how his prejudices had clouded his judgment and led him to treat another human being with unwarranted suspicion and aggression. As the watch commander approached, notepad already in hand, the captain knew this incident would become more than just a disciplinary matter. It would become a teaching moment for the entire department, a real-world example of how implicit bias could affect even routine interactions. The very thing she'd been trying to address in her precinct had just landed in her lap in the most personal way possible. The watch commander's office had never felt so small. An hour after the incident, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as he reviewed the body camera footage for the third time. Each viewing made him wince more than the last. Beside him, the captain sat calmly, but hands folded in her lap, watching her colleague's reaction to the video. The watch commander paused the footage, rubbing his temples. This is exactly what we've been trying to prevent. The hand on the holster, the aggressive tone, the assumptions, it's all there. He looked at the captain with a mix of respect and embarrassment. I'm so sorry you had to experience this. Outside the office, Officer Thompson sat on a hard plastic chair, still in uniform but looking somehow smaller than he had earlier. Other officers walked past him, some shaking their heads, others purposely avoiding eye contact. The story had already spread through the department like wildfire, and the video clips from bystanders' phones were starting to circulate on social media. We need to handle this correctly, the captain said, leaning forward in her chair. Not just for me or for Officer Thompson, but for the entire department and our community. She pulled out her phone, showing the watch commander the growing number of shares and comments on the viral videos. This is going to be a major story by morning. The watch commander nodded gravely. He pressed the intercom button on his desk phone. Send Officer Thompson in, please. The young officer who had recognized the captain at the scene opened the door, gesturing for Thompson to enter. Thompson's usual confident stride was gone, replaced by hesitant steps as he approached the desk. Sit down, officer, the watch commander instructed, his tone professional but stern. Thompson sank into the chair next to the captain, carefully avoiding eye contact with her. His hands were clasped tightly in his lap, knuckles white with tension. We've reviewed your body camera footage, the watch commander began, along with the videos posted by witnesses. Before we proceed, do you have anything you'd like to say? The question hung in the air like heavy smoke, making the room feel even smaller. Thompson cleared his throat, his voice barely above a whisper. I made assumptions. I let my preconceptions guide my actions instead of following proper procedure. He finally turned to face the captain. I didn't see you as a fellow officer, or even as a person deserving of basic respect. I saw what I wanted to see, and I acted on prejudices I didn't even realize I was carrying. The captain listened carefully, noting the genuine realization in his voice. This wasn't just a rehearsed apology from an officer trying to save his job. This was the sound of someone truly understanding their mistakes for the first time. Your body camera caught everything, the watch commander continued. The unnecessary aggression, the escalation, the refusal to listen. But it also caught something else. It caught what racial profiling looks like from the victim's perspective. And in this case, the victim happened to be one of our most respected captains. Outside the office, the night shift was changing over to morning. Officers gathering for briefing were already discussing the incident, some arguing about proper procedure, others sharing their own experiences with racial profiling. The conversation that the captain had been trying to start for years was finally happening organically. "Here's what's going to happen," the watch commander announced, sitting up straighter in his chair. "Internal Affairs will conduct a full investigation. Your body camera footage will be used in future training sessions. You're suspended pending the investigation, and you'll be required to complete extensive bias training before any consideration of reinstatement." Thompson nodded, accepting each point without argument. The fight had gone out of him, replaced by something that looked like understanding. The captain watched him carefully, recognizing the potential for real change in his demeanor. "I'd like to add something," she said, her voice firm but not unkind. "This incident, as unfortunate as it was, has given us an opportunity. We can use it to show our officers and our community that we're serious about addressing bias in law enforcement. Officer Thompson, you're not the only one carrying these prejudices. You're just the one who got caught acting on them in the most visible way possible." The watch commander looked at her with admiration. Even after being mistreated, she was thinking about the bigger picture, about how to turn this negative incident into positive change. The next few weeks would be challenging for everyone involved, but maybe, just maybe, some good could come from this unfortunate traffic stop. The police department's press conference room was packed to capacity 3 days after the incident. News cameras lined the back wall, their red lights blinking like artificial stars. The chief of police stood at the podium, flanked by the captain and other high-ranking officers. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. "We've gathered here today," the chief began, his voice steady but somber, "to address an incident that occurred this past Sunday evening. By now, many of you have seen the videos circulating on social media." Behind him, a screen displayed still images from the body camera footage, each frame telling its own story of bias and misconduct. Reporters scribbled frantically in their notepads as the chief continued. "What happened that evening was unacceptable. One of our most respected captains was profiled, harassed, and physically confronted by an officer who let his prejudices override his training and judgment." The chief paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. In the front row, community leaders nodded in agreement. They'd been raising concerns about racial profiling for years, but this incident was different. This time, the victim was a high-ranking officer, and the evidence was undeniable. The captain stepped forward to the podium, her presence commanding immediate attention. "I spent 15 years serving this community," she began, her voice clear and strong. "I've trained officers, implemented programs, and worked to build trust between law enforcement and our citizens. What happened to me on Sunday is something that many members of our community face regularly." The room fell silent as she shared her experience, describing the feelings of helplessness and frustration, even as someone with authority and rank. Her words painted a vivid picture of how prejudice could cloud judgment and create dangerous situations. "But this isn't about punishing one officer," she continued. "This is about acknowledging a systemic issue and taking real steps to address it." She gestured to a stack of papers on the podium. "Today, we're announcing new mandatory training programs and policy changes that will help prevent similar incidents in the future." The chief returned to the podium, outlining the specific changes: enhanced bias training for all officers, regular reviews of body camera footage, community oversight committees, and revised traffic stop procedures. Each announcement was met with murmurs of approval from the assembled crowd. Meanwhile, across town at the police academy, new recruits watched the press conference on television. Their training instructor had paused their regular lessons to let them witness this moment. The room was quiet as they absorbed the implications of what they were seeing, how a single traffic stop could expose deep-rooted issues within the system they were preparing to join. Back at the press conference, reporters' hands shot up as the question and answer session began. "What about Officer Thompson?" one journalist called out. Will he face termination? The chief handled the question diplomatically. The officer is currently suspended pending a full investigation. He will undergo extensive retraining and evaluation before any decisions are made about his future with the department. However, this incident has shown us that we need to focus on prevention rather than just punishment. The captain nodded in agreement. She'd already met with training officers to develop new scenarios based on her experience. Future officers would role-play similar situations, learning to recognize and overcome their implicit biases before they led to dangerous confrontations. As the press conference continued, social media exploded with responses. The department's proposed changes were being shared, analyzed, and discussed across platforms. Community activists who had long pushed for reform were cautiously optimistic, while police departments across the country began reaching out to learn more about the new training programs. In a quiet corner of the station, veteran officers watched the coverage on a break room TV. Some shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, recognizing their own potential biases. Others nodded in approval at the proposed changes, understanding that this moment could mark a turning point in their profession. The captain's final words at the press conference resonated throughout the department. "What happened to me was unfortunate, but it's given us a unique opportunity. We can show our community that we're willing to learn from our mistakes, that we can acknowledge our biases, and that we're committed to becoming better officers and better human beings. This isn't the end of the story, it's just the beginning of real change." 6 months had passed since that fateful traffic stop, and the police department's training room was buzzing with activity. The captain stood at the front, addressing a mixed group of veteran officers and new recruits. The body camera footage from that night played on the large screen behind her, but this time, it wasn't just about her experience, it was about transformation. "What you're watching isn't just a video of racial profiling," she explained, pausing the footage at a crucial moment. "It's a wake-up call that changed our entire department." The room was silent, officers leaning forward in their chairs, completely engaged. Some had watched this footage dozens of times, but its impact hadn't diminished. At the back of the room sat Officer Thompson, now reinstated after completing extensive retraining. He wasn't required to attend these sessions anymore, but he chose to be there. His experience had become a powerful teaching tool, and his transformation had surprised everyone, including himself. "I'd like Officer Thompson to share his perspective," the captain said, gesturing for him to join her. Thompson walked to the front, his demeanor notably different from 6 months ago. Gone was the aggressive stance and arrogant attitude. In their place was a humility and awareness that could only come from genuine self-reflection. "That night, I thought I was just doing my job," Thompson began, his voice carrying clearly across the room. "But I was actually doing exactly what we're trained not to do, letting bias control my actions." He pointed to specific moments in the frozen video frame. "Look at my hand on my holster. Look at my aggressive stance. There was no threat, but I created one in my mind based on nothing but prejudice." The changes in the department went far beyond training sessions. New protocols for traffic stops had been implemented, requiring officers to clearly state their reasons for pulling someone over before asking for any documentation. Body camera footage was now randomly reviewed by a committee that included community members, ensuring accountability at every level. In the community, the impact was evident. Local organizations reported a noticeable improvement in police interactions. Traffic stop data showed more consistent treatment across racial and ethnic groups. The captain's story had become a catalyst for real change, not just in their department, but in police academies across the country. "But the most important change," the captain continued, addressing the room, "isn't in our policies or procedures. It's in our mindset." She clicked to the next slide, showing statistics from the past 6 months. These numbers tell a story of improvement, but the real story is in the daily interactions that don't make headlines. A young officer raised her hand. "How do we maintain this progress? How do we make sure we don't slip back into old habits?" It was a question that showed how far they'd come. Officers were now actively engaged in preventing bias, not just avoiding its consequences. Thompson stepped forward again. "It's about constant awareness," he said, speaking from experience. "Every time I approach a vehicle now, I ask myself, am I seeing the person or am I seeing my assumptions about them?" His words resonated with the room. They'd all learned to ask themselves similar questions. The captain pulled up another slide, this one showing photos from community outreach events. Officers and citizens working together, building trust through understanding. This is what real police work looks like, she said. It's not about power or control. It's about service and protection for everyone equally. At that moment, a notification popped up on several officers' phones. Their department had just been recognized nationally for its reformed training program. The captain smiled, but quickly brought the focus back to what mattered most. Awards are nice, but they're not why we do this. We do this because every person who drives through our city deserves to feel safe, not targeted. As the training session wrapped up, officers lingered to discuss their own experiences and challenges. The conversation was open, honest, and productive, exactly what the captain had hoped for when she first decided to use her incident as a teaching tool. Thompson approached her after the room had cleared. "You know," he said, "when this first happened, I thought my career was over. I never imagined it would lead to something like this." The captain nodded, understanding the weight of his words. "Sometimes the best lessons come from our biggest mistakes," she replied. "What matters is what we do with those lessons." She gathered her materials, ready to head to her next meeting. There was always more work to be done, more progress to be made. As she walked through the department hallways, she noticed officers watching body camera footage together, discussing better ways to handle situations. In the break room, veterans were mentoring rookies about community engagement. The change wasn't just in policies or procedures, it was in the department's DNA now. The incident that could have ended careers had instead launched a movement of positive change. It wasn't perfect, and there was still work to be done, but they were moving in the right direction. One traffic stop had opened eyes, changed minds, and proved that real transformation was possible, one officer, one interaction, one day at a time.